The whole world knew him as the world's youngest leader, but nobody knew what he was fighting alone in the corridors of his palace that night. The velvet darkness that descended upon Ouagadougou that night was not the harbinger of an ordinary night. Behind the high walls of the Koziam Palace, the 34-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré felt the entire weight of a nation on his shoulders. From his office window, the flickering lights of the city stretched out like a terrestrial galaxy. Each light represented a family, a life that pinned its hopes on him. The blue light reflecting from the slim tablet in his hand illuminated his tired but steel-like determined face, especially his eyes, which never for a moment ceased to focus on the future. The report was brief, but every word was like a dagger. Terrorist groups in the north have mobilized simultaneously. Their logistical support is 10 times the normal level. External connection confirmed. This was not a desperate attack by scattered cells. This was the beginning of a symphony directed by a military brain with precise timing, and the conductor was sitting in Paris. Traoré, thanks to his geology education, knew how to read the hidden fault lines between the Earth's layers. Now he had to read the much more dangerous geopolitical fault lines threatening his country's fate. Beneath his calm exterior lay the sharp intellect and composure of a former Cobra Special Forces member, capable of making decisions in seconds even in the most chaotic moments. He was the man on whose shoulders the ghost of Thomas Sankara, from whom he drew strength every night from a worn book on the edge of his desk, touched. He had sworn to free his country from neo-colonial shackles and restore dignity to his people. But the most shocking thing was that the betrayal came from his closest circle, from the fortress he trusted the most. Traoré turned to Kabore, his eyes showing neither anger nor panic, just an ice-cold resolve. Watch Bamako. Every step, every breath. His digital footprint, his financial movements, his secret meetings. I want to know who he's talking to, what he's planning, but never, not for a single moment, let him suspect anything. For now, he is still this country's hero, the Minister of Defense. This was a war of nerves, of wills, and of mass. Traoré would have to shake General Bamogo's hand at the next day's National Security Council meeting, as if nothing had happened, and discuss the joint measures to be taken against terrorism. When he looked into Bamogo's eyes during the meeting, he saw a tiny glint of victory behind those cold, calculating gazes. As Bamako talked about how happy his family was in Paris, how successful his daughter was in her studies at the Sorbonne, Traoré read the threat beneath every word. This was as much a ruthless hostage situation as it was a betrayal. It was at this very point that Traoré made the historic decision that would pit him against the entire world. He would not play the game by their rules. He would set his own rules, his own chessboard. As soon as the meeting ended, he secretly summoned the commander of the Cobra unit and one other person to the most secure room in the palace. This person was one of the country's brightest minds, who had a doctorate in cybersecurity and economic warfare from MIT and was the head of the Economic Intelligence Unit, EIU. Personally appointed by Traoré, Dr. Amina Konaté. Amina, in her late 20s, was slender but projected an iron will with her posture, a genius at uncovering the lies behind numbers and data with surgical precision. She was the most important weapon in Traoré's new, asymmetric war. At that moment, the encrypted message from the Cobra unit would change everything. The message landed on Cabra's private tablet and appeared on the screen. Vulture 7, Vulture 7, active. Target, Kaya Air Base. Objective, to paralyze the country's air defense. Vulture 7 was a code name, a brand of death used by the DGSE in its deadliest operations in the Sahel. General Bamako was preparing to hand over the heart of the country's air defense system, its most critical component, to the enemy at its weakest moment. According to the plan, when the terrorists launched a major attack from the north, Burkina Faso's fighter jets and helicopters would be unable to take off due to the systems Bamako would sabotage, leaving the capital Ouagadougou completely defenseless. Traoré looked at the map again. Kaya was the capital's last line of defense. He had only 48 hours to stop them. His options were narrowing: either arrest Bamako immediately and risk an insurrection within the army and a civil war, or let the plan proceed until the last moment and catch the French and their pawn red-handed. This was not just a military operation, but his last chance to save his reputation before his people and the future of the revolution. "Prepare," Traore told the Cobra commander. "We're going to hunt vultures." Then he turned to Dr. Konate, his voice calm. "Amina, I want all the financial movements of Bamako and all the French companies he has been in contact with for the last 6 months. Not a single cent is to be missed. Trace that money, find the bill for the treason." You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. The secret file prepared for him in Paris was about to change everything. That file was kept in a steel safe in the Africa desk in the deepest parts of the Alizé Palace. Its codename was Sankara's Ghost, and its contents were proof of how modern and ruthless colonialism was. It contained everything from Traoré's psychological profile, his favorite food to his greatest fears, and even a list of potential names to be used to overthrow him. On the last page of the file was a detailed draft of an assassination plan. The key figure in the plan was shocking. The son of one of the men who had betrayed and organized the assassination of Thomas Sankara years ago, now the head of African operations for the French Foreign Intelligence Service, DGS. History was lying in wait to repeat the same bloody scenario with different actors. Traoré was unaware of this file, but his intuition whispered to him that the greatest danger lay much deeper than the approaching terrorist attack. He couldn't sleep that night. He carried the loneliness of a nation, alone on his young shoulders. No one within the gilded walls of the palace knew the anxiety he felt for the future of his people. When the phone rang long after midnight, he recognized that the muffled voice on the other end was from Moscow. The conversation was short, direct, and full of negotiation. The Russian military advisors were monitoring every bird's flight in the Sahel with their satellite networks and signal intelligence capabilities. "Captain," said the deep voice on the phone, carrying the coldness of a former KGB agent, "we are aware of the French movements in Kaya and of your pawn. We can provide you with real-time satellite imagery of the operation, transcripts of all encrypted conversations, and signal intelligence. But this comes at a price." Traoré knew what the price was. This meant an irreversible break from the West and the official declaration of a strategic partnership with Russia. This move could save his country from a civil war, but it would also draw him into a much larger game on a global chessboard, where bishops fought with pawns. He had 2 paths before him: either accept the austerity policies imposed by the IMF and Paris to feed his people and compromise on independence, or choose an honorable struggle, risking famine and isolation for his country. He had only a few seconds to answer. "We have a deal," he said without hesitation. "Send the intelligence." There was no time to think about how this deal would affect China in the long run, or what secret military clauses it contained. "Wait a minute, don't miss this detail. You'll never guess who the agent at that meeting was." That agent was a blonde French woman who managed the UN's humanitarian aid programs, spoke of peace and human rights in every speech, fluently spoke local languages, and was admired by everyone. But she was actually one of the DGSE's most dangerous field operatives, and she had personally recruited General Bamako by threatening him with his daughter's future. The intelligence package from the Russians hit the operations center like a lightning bolt, completing all the missing pieces of the puzzle. French special forces, under the guise of a convoy of trucks with humanitarian aid written in large letters, would cross the border, meet the terrorists at an abandoned uranium mine near Kaya, and infiltrate the base. General Bamako, under the pretext of a sudden technical failure inspection that night, would disable all the base's radar and security systems for 15 minutes. Everything was perfectly planned. Traoré now had all the details, times, even names. Now it was time to conduct his own symphony. "Operation Broken Wing," said Traoré, explaining the plan on the map to the elite commanders of the Cobra unit. "Bamako will execute his plan. The French will walk into the trap. The terrorists will come to the meeting point. But when they get there, they will find us waiting for them in the depths of the mine." This was an extremely risky gamble. The slightest leak, the smallest mistake, could result in everything ending in a bloody disaster. The glint in Traoré's eyes was a sign that an impossible plan had already begun, and there was no turning back. The night before the operation, Traore did something unexpected, defying all protocols. He visited Thomas Sankare's grave. He was alone, with neither a guard nor an aide. In those hours when the red and purple tones of twilight painted the sky, it is impossible to describe the weight of the historical responsibility he felt while standing at that modest grave. He lived the deep silence of that moment, his internal monologues, and the splendor of the fiery legacy he had inherited in his mind with long, descriptive sentences. "My commander," he whispered, his voice mingling with the wind, "I have sworn to finish the sacred march you started, to restore honor to this land, and to ensure my people can hold their heads high. I will die with my honor, but I will never allow my people to be condemned to a future without honor." At that moment, what stood there was not just a young captain, but the rekindled immortal spirit of a revolution. No one knew that this determined leader also couldn't sleep at night, that he carried in his eyes the anxiety he felt for his people's future, the deep sorrow he sometimes felt like a father, sometimes like an older brother. When he returned to the palace, he found a note in the middle of his desk in his locked office. It had only one word written on it: caution. It was not clear who left the note, a friend in the palace or a more complex part of the trap. Suspicion began to fall like a poisonous shadow even on the most loyal men. You won't believe it, but when it was revealed who those gold reserves actually belonged to, everything became clear with the emergency report Dr. Konaté presented that night. In addition to the 45 tons of official reserves in Paris, it was documented that at least as much gold had been smuggled out of the country through unofficial channels over the last 5 years, through terrorist organizations and collaborator politicians transferred to secret accounts in Switzerland. This was not just a robbery, but the fuel for a conspiracy that would set the entire Sahel on fire. When the night of the operation arrived, a deep, unsettling silence reigned in Ouagadougou. Traore, in the operations center set up in the bunker beneath the palace, was watching everything moment by moment on giant screens. Thermal images from Russian satellites showed the French convoy moving like a phantom snake in the desert. General Bamogo, as planned, had arrived at Kaya Air Base and begun his inspection. Everything was running like clockwork. The terrorist groups were also moving towards the meeting point, the abandoned uranium mine. At that very moment, the meaning of the small note left on Traore's desk became painfully clear. One of the screens in the operations center suddenly went black, the pixels cascading like a green waterfall. Then another. They were under a cyber attack. Communication, satellite connection. Everything was cut. Traore's only link with his Cobra unit was severed. At that moment, the burden on the young man's shoulders crashed down on him like a mountain. He was alone, blind and deaf. What you've seen so far is nothing. The real operation began at midnight. Traore did not hesitate for a moment. He gave the order: switch to the backup plan. The backup plan was the product of an old-school military mind that always knew technology could betray radio silence and predetermined visual signals. The Cobras moved out. They were not the ones who made war plans in luxurious offices. They were the children of the land. When the French special forces and the terrorists reached the meeting point, the dark mouth of the mine, they were met with an eerie silence. There were no signs of Bamogo's men or anything else. By the time they realized they had fallen into a trap, it was too late. From the depths of the mine and the slopes of the valley, hundreds of Cobra soldiers hidden in the darkness of the night opened the gates of hell. The firefight began. The traitors were captured, but the real shock would come when it was understood that the one who set the trap was General Bamogo himself. Bamogo had played both sides. He had tried to save himself by betraying the French and remaining loyal to Traore at the last minute. But Traore didn't fall for this simple game. When the palace door opened with a loud noise, he saw that the person standing before him was his most trusted commander. General Bamogo stood there, not with a weapon in his hand, but with an expression of false heroism and feigned surrender. "Mr. President," he said, out of breath, "it's all over. I foiled their plans. I exposed your trap." Traore looked into Bamogo's eyes, Into the darkest corner of his soul, he saw fear, a search for a bargain, and a pathetic cunning. "You didn't foil my plan, General," he said in a calm voice, but each word struck like a whip. "You were part of my plan from the very beginning." At that moment, Bamogo's face turned white. The blood drained from it. He understood that Traore had anticipated the possibility of a cyber attack, that he had calculated from the beginning that Bamogo would panic and switch sides to save himself when communication was cut. Bamogo was a pawn sacrificed by a chess master for victory. Just when they thought the danger had passed, everything was reset when Dr. Konate entered the room with a tablet in her hand. "Mr. President, we found the source of the cyber attack. It's coming from the main finance ministry server inside the palace. The real snake is still among us, and it has access to our treasury." This was the harbinger of a conspiracy larger and more dangerous than Bamogo. As French special forces landed on the border by helicopter, the Russian advisors moved on Traoré's command. The war was no longer secret, but open. The next morning, Traoré appeared before the world press. Beside him were handcuffed French soldiers and captured state-of-the-art weapons. In a calm voice, he exposed this neo-colonial conspiracy against Burkina Faso's sovereignty with all the evidence, name by name, date by date. The trembling in his voice at the press conference was not from anger, but from the unbearable weight of the betrayal done to his people and those closest to him. When his speech ended, he announced that he had asked the French ambassador to leave the country within 24 hours. This was a historic challenge by an African country to its former colonial power. The reaction from Paris was immediate and ruthless: an economic embargo, the cutting of all aid, and most importantly, the official announcement that the 45-ton gold reserve in the Banque de France was frozen. Within hours, the country was on the brink of bankruptcy, chaos, and famine. Traoré would either have to risk starving his people or kneel with a dishonorable deal. He chose a third way, Sankara's way. He called an emergency meeting of the AES Alliance of Sahel states, formed with Mali and Niger. Before the meeting, he had a final situation assessment with Dr. Konate. When he read that intelligence report, he understood that the infiltrators in the country's largest gold mine were not just a French company, but an American private security firm collaborating with them and a Swiss bank that laundered these operations. The enemy was not on a single front. The octopus's tentacles had wrapped around everything. The AES leaders made a joint decision for the first time in history. All three countries were ending the French military presence, removing French as an official language, and most importantly, establishing a common economic defense mechanism against their frozen reserves, laying the foundation for a new currency. This was the declaration of Africa's economic war of liberation. Pan-Africanism was transforming from a dream in books into reality. When a 34-year-old captain told the giants exploiting his country, "It's over now," no one could believe the betrayal he would experience the next day. But he had turned this betrayal into the fuse of a continental revolution. When he went to New York to give his speech at the UN General Assembly, everyone expected diplomatic, roundabout sentences from him. However, Traoré went to the podium with the file prepared by Dr. Konate, which revealed the theft of 45 tons of gold with all the documents and SWIFT codes. Deviating from his script, he read out the name of the Banque de France, the account numbers of the Swiss bank, and the names of the CEOs of the collaborating companies one by one. Everyone in the hall was frozen. The real reason he spoke those harsh words was an intelligence report he had received just 7 minutes before the speech. Paris was planning to use the UN to send a peacekeeping force to Burkina Faso and effectively occupy the country. Traoré's speech was a nuclear bomb that ended this plan before it even began. That night his hotel room phone rang. The voice on the phone was familiar. It was the voice of the man who had betrayed Sankara years ago, now aged, but retaining the same venomous tone. "Young man," the voice said, "you won't be able to do what your father couldn't. Africa's destiny is written in our hands." Traoré replied, looking at the lights of New York from the window. "You may write the destiny," he said, "but we will rewrite history." When he hung up the phone, he knew the war had just begun, but he was no longer alone. Behind him were not only the people of Burkina Faso, but also brilliant minds like Dr. Konate and the awakening, chain-breaking spirit of a continent, and that spirit would never sleep again. The first blow came from where it was expected, the economy. Before the ink on the embargo decisions had dried, their effects were being felt on the street. Medicine and food ships waiting in ports changed their routes, international banks suspended all money transfers, SWIFT system with Burkina Faso, and the country's scarce oil reserves were on the verge of depletion. The people carried him on their shoulders. But how long could a revolution last with empty stomachs and hospitals without medicine? Traore was at the head of the crisis table day and night. Aid from Russia and China was vital, but not enough to break the West's economic blockade. It was in these moments of desperation that the secret investigation led by Dr. Amina Konate took on a new dimension. The traces of the cyber attack from the palace's finance ministry server had been professionally erased. But Amina had followed a different path. She discovered that during the attack, a copy of the data leaked from the server had been sent as an encrypted package to a place no one would think of, a sub-server used by the Ministry of Agriculture for weather forecast. This was like hiding a treasure in a swamp, illogical, brilliant, and extremely suspicious. The snake was not only venomous, but also very clever. When Amina presented this new information to Traore, they both stood before the map. "Why the Ministry of Agriculture?" Traore asked, pointing to the country's most fertile plains. "What does it have to do with gold, with weapons?" Amina's eyes lit up. "Maybe we're asking the wrong question, Mr. President. Maybe the issue isn't just about gold. Maybe the real war is for the land itself." Following this conversation, Traore decided to make one of the most audacious moves in history. If the West was cutting off their money, medicine, and food, then Burkina Faso would become self-sufficient, just like in Sankora's dream. He launched Operation Sahel's Granary, Operation Grenier du Sahel. The plan was to distribute all state-owned land to the people, import millions of seeds, and make the country self-sufficient in food in a single planting season. This was not just an economic plan, but an honorable rebellion against the fate of hunger imposed by colonialism. What they didn't know yet was that the enemy had foreseen this move before them and had already put their counterplan into action. The enemy had realized that Traore could not be broken by economic pressure. If he found a way to feed his people, he could make the revolution permanent. So they changed their target. Reaching Traore was impossible. He was surrounded by a steel wall of cobras. So they targeted the brain of the revolution, Dr. Amina Konate. That evening, as Amina was heading home after a long day at the EIU, she noticed a truck blocking her usual route. When the driver directed her to an alternative side street, she had only seconds to realize it was a trap. Two black jeeps cornered her car in the narrow street. When men in ski masks, clearly professional assassins, moved towards the vehicle, it seemed all was lost for Amina. But Traore never left his most valuable assets unprotected. Two Cobra soldiers, following behind Amina's car as a civilian escort, and unnoticed by the assassins, immediately took up positions. In the short but fierce shootout that followed, two of the attackers were neutralized, while one was captured wounded. This incident showed that the war was no longer just economic or political, but had become extremely personal and bloody. The young man who carried the loneliness of a nation on his shoulders now had to protect the people he trusted most as well. The interrogation of the wounded assassin revealed the most critical piece of the puzzle. The man wasn't talking, but the cobras were more stubborn than him. A sample was taken from the mud stuck to his boots. Traore, with his geologist identity, stepped in. Under the microscope, he determined that the pollens and mineral structure in the mud were found in only one place in Burkina Faso, in a rare geological formation near the southern city of Bobo-Dioulasso. This was the location of a huge, high-security experimental farm that the Ministry of Agriculture called developing native seeds resistant to genetically modified organisms. The place where the data was hidden was the same as the place the assassin came from. At that moment, everything made sense. The traitor wasn't selling the country's future, but its very soil. The expression on Traore's face became stony. "We're going tonight," he told Colonel Cabaret. "Just 12 men, and Dr. Konate will come with us. Whatever we find there, she needs to copy its digital traces on the spot." At midnight, 2 civilian-looking helicopters landed silently near the experimental farm, flying low to avoid radar. Traore and his most elite Cobra team infiltrated the facility like ghosts. From the outside, it looked like a normal agricultural area, cornfields, greenhouses, but when they descended into the huge underground hangars, the sight they encountered was unbelievable. This was not a farm, but a giant mining operation equipped with the latest technology. But they were not extracting gold or uranium. What they were extracting were the rare earth elements considered the oil of the future, used in everything from smartphones to war missiles, coltan, lithium, and cobalt. And the person in charge of the operation was none other than the beloved, elderly, and fatherly Minister of Agriculture, who appeared on television every morning to give advice to farmers. For years, he had been secretly extracting the country's most valuable minerals, declaring them as agricultural products, and selling them to a Franco-American technology giant. He was the traitor. While he watched the country struggle with hunger, he was stealing the wealth beneath their feet. When the minister was caught, there was neither remorse nor fear on his face, only cold contempt. Looking Traore in the face, he hissed, "Be proud of this little victory, Captain. But you are too late. You cannot stop the famine protocol. It has already been activated." These words had the effect of a bomb in the operations center. What was the famine protocol? Amina began a frantic search on the seized servers. Hours later, she stood before Traore, her face as white as a sheet. "I found it," she said, her voice trembling. This is a plan for genocide." The protocol was a 2-stage biological attack. Stage 1, through the seed distribution centers, controlled by the Minister of Agriculture, seeds that were genetically modified to be sterile after a single harvest had been secretly distributed across the country. This would make planting the following year impossible. The second and more terrifying stage was a specially designed crop plague and a chemical-resistant locust swarm, developed in laboratories in neighboring countries and planned to be released within a few weeks. The aim was to finish Traore's Sahel's granary operation before it even began, to turn the fields into deserts, and to condemn the country to absolute famine, forcing the people to rebel against their leader. This was a modern, silent invasion, conducted not with tanks and guns but with seeds and insects. Now, time was measured not in hours but in sunsets. Traore had only a few weeks to save his people and his revolution. The whole world thought the trap had been sprung, but the real shock was that the trap had been set in the soil itself. Traore made the most difficult decision of his life at that moment. Instead of causing panic, he trusted his people to the end. He went on national television, but this time there were no soldiers or flags behind him. He stood in a dusty field in a village outside the capital, with elderly farmers beside him. He held a handful of healthy indigenous seeds. "My brothers and sisters," he began his speech, his voice echoing in homes across the country. "We are facing a great game, a great betrayal. They stole our gold, we resisted. They infiltrated our army, we defeated them. Now they want to steal our land, our bread, our future. They sent us poisoned seeds from outside. They want to unleash disease on our fields, to destroy our harvest with swarms of locusts." He paused for a moment, looking through the eye of the camera into the eyes of millions of people. "They think they can discipline us with hunger. They think they can force us to our knees. But there is one thing they do not know." He clenched the soil in his hand. "This land is not just soil. This land is our mother, our honor, our character. And we, the honorable people of Burkina Faso, will never sell our land." When his speech ended, something unexpected happened. People from all over the country, old women, young people, children, began to take out the indigenous seeds passed down from their ancestors from their homes and barns and bring them to the village squares. This was a second revolution against the famine protocol. It was the people's own seed protocol. Traore was not just leading a country, he had ignited a spirit, an unshakable will. The war would now continue in the fields, in every stalk of wheat, in every ear of corn. And this was the war they knew best.